Welcome to Parshat Vayigash, second to last one in Sefer Breshit, with our commentary by Nechama Leibowitz. And I used here, she wrote an essay, but I will say there's very little writing here. She mostly shared a very long midrash from the midrash of Tanchuma. And okay, here we go. So she's going to open it up, and I meant to pull this up. My apologies. She is jumping off. One of the interesting things about using essays from her book is that they build on each other often. And so her first essay explored the speech, the impassioned speech that Yehuda makes at the very beginning of the Parsha, right? Vayigash means to come close, and it's Vayigash Yehuda. Yehuda comes close to Yosef, right? And he makes this, ooh, looks like it's going to be in some funny language. Yeah. Interesting. Um, okay, that's fine. Weird, but fine. Um, I'm just trying to pull up the Sefaria. Let's see. I must have hit Dutch instead of this week. Yeah, there we go. Okay. And so she references Yehuda's speech. So I just wanted to quickly set the stage here. Right. So Yehuda comes up to Yosef, right? He says, please listen, don't be impatient with me. Um, he recounts a lot of the story. You asked if I have a father or another brother. Well, we do have an old father, and we have a child of his old age, right? As a Yeled Zekunim Katan, Binyamin. His full brother, right? Yosef is dead, so that he is alone, left of his mother, right? Rachel dies in basically in childbirth with Binyamin, and his father dotes on him. Right. And he says, well, so you're telling me to leave the boy here? I cannot leave him here because his father would actually die. Right. Leaving Binyamin is not an option. And he says, but you just said to me that unless he comes, then I don't want to see you. Right. And so he's in trouble. It's one of the longest what's the word for a single speech? Soliloquy, right? One of the longest speeches given by one person at one time. And a lot of it is a recap of what has happened so far. And he says, if you do this, it's really going to be the end of my father Yaakov. And so if you need someone to stay, the climax of his speech, right, is let me stay here, tachat hanar, in place of Binyamin. And Binyamin should go with his brothers back to his father. And this speech, for whatever reason, really pushes Yosef over the edge, and he sends all the Egyptians out of the room, and he starts crying, and he tells his brothers that it is him, Yosef. And his brothers are nervous. And so Yosef says to them, Geshu, right? Same verb as Vayigash. And when they come forward, he says, I am your brother. And he says, you sold me, Asher machartem oti mitzrayma, right? But al te'atzvuv al yichar be'enechem. Do not be distressed or reproach yourselves because you sold me. And he goes on to say, God is the one who made this all happen. So this is the backdrop upon which Nechama Leibowitz is going to bring this midrash. Now, I will say what I plan to say in Shul is that does not sit well with me, this turn of events, right? Yehuda being so patient and conciliatory to Yosef and being so careful, and Yosef forgiving so quickly. To me, it feels very on the surface, like whitewashed almost, right? Like I wish that I could be as Yosef and forgive and forget so easily. Um, but I think that's very difficult. And I wish I could be like Yehuda and not give in to my feelings, right? And just be able to sort of calmly make my argument for things when I actually feel very emotional about that. And I think that the Midrash, which Nechama Leibowitz quotes for us, is almost like the understory. Right. In my kids' classes, they talk about thought bubbles versus speech bubbles, right? Like if someone says something a little bit unkind, they say, well, was that a thought bubble or a speech bubble? Like, should you have just thought in your head or said it out loud, right? So the Parsha is giving us the speech bubbles. And I think that this midrash is going to give us the thought bubbles, sort of the undercurrent to the conversation, which I think is very healthy. The way that Nechama Leibovich understands it is that it's like Yehuda's perspective, but I would encourage us to think about it also from Yosef's perspective. Okay, with that very long introduction, let's jump into her essay. Right, so the beginning two sentences that two paragraphs she opens with are her own words. Right, she says, we analyzed in the previous chapter of our studies on the Sidra, right? So this is what I said, the last chapter. Hello, Judith. The last chapter that the first chapter on Vayigash that she has, she analyzed Yehuda's moving speech, which marks the climax of the story of Yosef and his brothers. Yehuda uttered it at the most critical juncture. The brothers who had once been strangers to the feeling of brotherhood, who had been deaf to his entreaties, sold him into slavery, were now put to the test. Would they leave the other brother, a son of Rachel too, in bondage and return to their aged father once again, a brother by Rachel short? I love that phrase, right? Or would they fight to rescue him even at the cost of their own freedom, right? Rabbi Sachs writes a very beautiful essay about this idea that we had talked about this, that the test that Yosef put the brothers through, right? Why not just tell them right away who he was? It must be because he wanted to see the dreams come true, right? But here, the way that Nechama Leibovich is phrasing it is like he wanted to see if they were going to do full teshuva, right? What does the Rambam say? Full teshuva is when you wouldn't do something when the opportunity comes again. And so here, Yehuda is in that very same spot, right? Binyamin is the one giving him trouble now. And Yosef wants to see, will he sell Binyamin, so to speak? Will he say, just leave Binyamin here, right? A brother by Rachel short. Or will he do something different in this space? And so she says, Judah, as we have noted, it probably should have been resorted in his speech to every psychological and rhetorical device to stir the feelings of the Egyptian. Our sages, however, turned the speech into a duel of words, a tussle between Yosef and Yehuda. Right. And so I love that. I love that language also, right? A duel of words and a tussle. So what was, as we saw, as we ran through the Sefaria, what was a very gentle and calm and professional conversation is going to become much more exciting. Okay, so the Midrash Tanchuma, right? Adoni Sha'al et Avadav, this is Yehuda speaking, right? And he says, Mitchila va'alila bata aleinu. Right, from the very outset, this is Yehuda talking to Yosef. You practice subterfuge towards us, right? Men have come to Egypt from numerous provinces to purchase grains, but you did not ask them. Perhaps you have come to marry our daughters, or perhaps you want to wed our sisters. Nevertheless, we've withheld nothing from you. And so it seems like what he's saying is, why are we getting some kind of weird special treatment? Treat us like all the other people coming to get grain, right? We know people are coming from all over the region. And Yosef retorts, right here, he does not listen quietly. He says, why do you speak in behalf of all of your brothers? I have discovered through this cup, that you do have older brothers and that you are indeed a garrulous creature, right? No one is holding back here. Yehuda replied, what you see is correct, but I'm compelled to speak because I pledged myself as a surety for my brother, right? When Yaakov was approached by the 10 brothers saying, we need to bring Binyamin with us, Yaakov said no. He said, I have learned my lesson. I'm not letting my brother by Rachel out of my sight. And Yehuda says, I will be the, what's that word? The not down payment, right? I will be, the pledge, the surety. There's an English word I can't think of. I won't come back without him, right? And Yosef can't help himself here, right? This is so hard. Can you imagine Yosef hearing this sentence that Yehuda saying, well, I'm responsible for my brothers? And he says, well, you certainly weren't responsible for your brother when you sold him to the Midianites for just 20 pieces of silver, right? And you also greatly distressed your father. Tarof Toraf Yosef, v'hu lo chatalach. Right? He says, Yosef did nothing wrong to you, and you didn't feel that you were the surety for your brother then, and you did horrible things to your father, right? And he says, but this one, i.e. Binyamin, zeh shechata v'nagav hagavia, right? He's the one who stole the goblet. He says, go tell your father the rope has followed after the bucket. Halach hachavel achar hadli. Now, I will admit that I still don't totally understand what that means. It's going to come up again. This is Yosef's mantra. I think what it means is that when you throw a bucket that's attached to a rope into a pit or into a well, the rope is going to follow. And no matter what you do later, you're not going to be able to stop the physics and gravity of the rope following the bucket. And so the bucket was selling Yosef, right? And this is the rope. This situation now is the rope, meaning there's nothing you can do to stop it, Yehuda. You already put this in motion a long time ago, but I am definitely open to other interpretations of this phrase. Right. So here Yehuda says, I am the surety for my brother, right? I am responsible for him. And Yosef doesn't say, oh, how nice, how wonderful that you've done teshuvah. He says, what about me? Why weren't you the surety for me? Right? I hear such a sadness in that retort. When Yehuda heard this, the rope follows the bucket business, he cried out in a loud voice. He cried out bitterly, right, with a bitterness of spirit. Amar right? He says, as it says in the Torah, how could I possibly go back to my father when he is not with me? And Yosef says to him, let us consider the matter between us. Tell me what you think and present your arguments. He says, I'm not giving up so easily. And Yehuda turns to Naphtali and he says, Lech ure'eh kama shvakim yesh b'Mitzrayim. Go count the number of central markets in Egypt. Kafatz v'chazar. Naphtali does it very quickly. Amar lo shneim mesar. He says there are 12 markets in Egypt. Amar Yehuda achav, ani achriv mehen shlosha. Right? I will destroy 3 of them, and each of you will destroy another. And lo nishar bahem ish. And I have to say, when I read this, it's a little startling, but I thought, this is the Yehuda I know. The Yehuda that flies off the handle, right? The Yehuda that is filled with anger, the Yehuda that is willing to sell his brother. This Yehuda that tells this nice speech to the Vizier of Egypt. That is not the Yehuda I know. And I think that the Midrash felt that way. The Midrash wanted to say everyone's character stays the way they are, right? You might change, but you don't change that much, right? And in fact, the brothers have to rein him in, and they say, Mitzrayim ena kishchem, right? Maybe you got away with that in Shechem. It's not going to work here. We cannot destroy all of Egypt, right? When you don't get what you want, Yehuda, you cannot have a temper tantrum and destroy all of Egypt. It's a fascinatingly difficult thing that the Midrash is putting in the hands of Yehuda. Right, so far, Yehuda tries his nice speech and it doesn't work. And Yosef, reminds him of how hurt he is. And instead of staying with his full teshuvah, he quickly flies off the handle, threatening to destroy all of Egypt. So Nechama Leibovich pulls us out of the Tanchuma for a second with no warning. And she plops us into Bereshit Rabbah, where there is the same story. Interestingly, here she introduced Chlushim, son of Dan. I love the Midrash about Chlushim. It's fascinating, right? So this is Yehuda's nephew. For anyone who learned Parsha with me, I think a while ago, maybe during my internship year, we learned about when the brothers go back to bury Yaakov in next week's Parsha. There is a bit of a kerfuffle outside of Marat Machpelah. And according to the Midrash, Esav comes back and says, I'm supposed to be buried in Maharat Machpelah. That couple, right, is not Yaakov and his wife, it's me and Yaakov, the twins. And Yaakov gave his spot to Leah, fine, but I'm keeping my spot. And Hushim gets so angry that he leaps up and he either beheads or eyeballs, I don't know the word for that, Esav. It's a very gruesome and sort of hard story, right? That's also his great uncle, right? Esav is his great uncle. So Hushim is like some of his uncles, is like a angry and hot-headed guy. And when Yehuda yells that great cry that the Tanhuma talks about, it's not his brothers that hear it, but it's Hushim, another really sort of violent, angry guy. And he leapt from the lands of Canaan. So this roar that Yehuda lets out is so loud that Hushim hears it in Canaan, and he comes next to Yehuda, and the two of them together roar. And the land of Egypt was on the verge of being upended. So Yehuda is not being diplomatic. He is so angry that he's about to destroy all of Egypt. So that's sort of act one of this conversation, right? So different from the Pshat. Let's look at the second part, and then maybe we'll try to figure out what's going on. So here, right, picking up, Nechama Leibush skips a middle portion, which I think is a wise move, although it was interesting, but it's about Yehuda being unable to sort of control his rage, or being able, but it's such a sharp and dangerous instrument, he has to like protect it carefully. Yehuda, now it says here that Yehuda railed at Yosef, which I like, but that is not what it says in the Hebrew. Amar lo Yehuda le Yosef, right? Yehuda says or yells at Yosef, like sort of similar to the beginning. You've given us a hard time this whole time, Yosef, right? First you said to us, you are spies, right? Amarta lanu meraglimatem. Then you said, Amarta lirot et arvat haaretz batem, that you came to see the nakedness of the city. And then you said, Giv'i ganavtem, right? You stole my cup. And he says, like, you're making it up. And then he says, right, I swear, ani nishba b'chaye avi hatzadik, my righteous father, va'ata nishbata b'chaye paro harasha, and you'll probably swear against the life of the wicked Paro. Imani otzia et charbi minikritzika, right? If I withdraw my sword from its sheath, amale kol hamitzrayim harugim. I will fill Egypt with corpses. It's like a horrible, angry threat to make. But what does Yosef say? It's like almost like hearing like playground taunting. Amar lo Yosef, im totzi charav minak ritzika, ani korcha al tzavarecha. I'm going to tie it around your neck. Right? I said to someone earlier, it sounds to me like a cartoon, right? Like Yehuda says, if I take out my sword, you're going to be sorry. And Yosef says, oh yeah? Your sword is so flimsy, I could tie it like a bow tie around your neck. It's like almost like they've reverted to being children again, right? They're just brothers scuffling with each other, like in the field. And Yehuda retorts to that. He says, Amar lo Yehuda, im eftach et pi evla otach. If I open my mouth, I will consume you. Amar lo Yosef, im tiftach picha, ani sotmo ba'aven. I'll stuff it with a stone. Right? It's like the Midrash is really experiencing Yehuda and Yosef at their worst, not at their best, right? Not at their most diplomatic and forgiving selves, but they are just a couple of brothers fighting like children. And again, Yehuda asks Yosef, well, what do I tell my father if I go home? And again, Yosef says, tell him, ahalach hachevel achar hadli. And Yehuda says to him, you are judging us falsely, right? Whatever you thought about us is wrong. We're not spies. We didn't come to see the nakedness of the land. We didn't steal your cup. Like, leave us alone. And Yosef can't let it go. And this, for me, I think the reason I feel so like impassioned about this midrash is like, this is the Yosef I would be. I'm not incredibly proud of it. Maybe one or two of you feels the same, right? I would not be able to say after being thrown in a pit, sold to numerous tradesmen, dealing with the whole Potiphar house situation, being thrown in jail, only getting out of jail because God was willing to help me out of jail, having to work really hard to create this new life. If my brothers came back, I would not be so gracious, right? Yehuda says, you judged us falsely. And Yosef says, well, you judged falsely already when you sold your brother, right? You judged me falsely. when you sold your brother. It's like a little confusing because the tenses are changing back and forth. But it's like, I also wouldn't let it go. Like you have to, you're gonna have to apologize multiple times before I'm able to let go being sold into slavery, right? And Yehuda answers, the fire of Shlem burns in my heart. Nura de Shlem dalik belibi, which I think is like a threat, right? Just like I did to Shlem, I'll do to Mitzrayim, as the Midrash alluded above. And Yosef says, Nura de Tamar kalatach ana metafe. Right? He says, I will extinguish the fire that burns within you, but not for Shlem, for your daughter-in-law Tamar. Right? He's bringing up all of Yehuda's worst moments. Right? It's so harsh. Even though I don't feel bad for Yehuda, I feel bad for Yehuda at this moment. Like that must be really hard. Yehuda's trying to do the right thing, and Yosef will not let go. And Yehuda says, I am consumed by anger. Right? Ratach ana. And to me, like, again, it's just so real. That is the Yehuda that I was expecting to see, a Yehuda consumed with anger. And Yosef says, again, sort of squabbling, I will break your anger, right? Ana mitzabar. Amar lo Yehuda, achshav ani etzei ve'etzba kol shevakim b'shebemitzrayim badam. I will go out and dye the marketplaces of Egypt in blood, right? It's very gruesome. It's like saying that there'll only be corpses in Egypt. It's like so violent and vicious. But what does Yosef say? He says, Tzebaim hayita miyimechem. Your whole life you've been dyeing things in blood. Shetzivatchem ketonet achichem badam, right? You dyed my coat in blood. Va'amartem la'avichem tarof toraf. He cannot let go, right? Yosef is not in forgiveness mode. He is like, remember when you sold me? Remember when you said I was dead? Remember when you dyed my coat? Nothing is going to make that better. And it gets to the point where he's so angry, where Yehuda is so angry that Yosef realizes that there's a strategic move he has to make here. And again, this is a wild departure from the pshat, right? The pshat is that he's so overcome with emotion by Yehuda's plea that he breaks down and says who he is. But the Midrash says, Kevan shera'a Yosef shet hiskima da'atem lahachriv et Mitzrayim. Right, when he saw that the brothers were going to destroy Mitzrayim, Amar Yosef belibo mutav she'et vada lahen va'al yachrivu et Mitzrayim. Better that I should let them know who I am than to risk the destruction of Egypt. Things had spiraled so far out of control that the only way Yosef knew to bring it in is to reveal himself. But he doesn't do it the way he does in the Pshat, which is like very straightforward and kind. He makes it this weird, almost like play, right? He says to them, did you know that your brother is actually not dead? I have purchased him, right? Ani kanitiv. And he starts calling for him. Hitchil kore, Yosef ben Yaakov, bo etzli. Yosef ben Yaakov, bo etzli. It's like, it makes me like feel worried for him, right? It's like he's lost it, right? He starts calling out to himself. Come, speak to your brothers. And the brothers, no sine nehem ba'arba pino tabai. They're probably really confused because there's no one else there, right? And then Yosef says, Lama atam mistaklin lakan v'lakan, ani Yosef achichem. Why are you looking everywhere? I am your brother. Miyad parcha nishmatan, right? It's a definitely a phrase of the Gemara, an Aramaic phrase that like their souls left them. They fainted, right? The story of the two rabbis, one who gets drunk on Purim, it's the same thing. I forget what he does, but parcha nafsho, his soul, the other one's soul leaves him. And they couldn't reply. And this is not my translation, this is Safari's, but I would almost put this in like a parenthetical box, right? Which is to say, this is not a part of the story, so we're going to come back to it in one moment. But at the end, God, so the brothers all died. They died of like fright or shock or something on the floor of this room because Yosef introduced himself in such a weird way, right? but God awakens them so that we can carry on with our hallmark ending, right? The sort of nicer shot level. So I want to come to this, but I want to say that I think this piece here, Rabbi Yochanan, is an interesting piece because he is saying we are in trouble. If Yosef could cause the brothers to faint simply by saying, I'm your brother, what will happen when the Holy One, blessed be he, arises to judge us? Right? If a mere human could scare the life out of us, right? How much more so will we be scared when God examines us? And I think that the this comparison to Yosef is interesting. I think if I was Rabbi Yochanan, I would have said, if Yosef can forgive after all this, then surely we should be able to forgive too. Right? It's a little bit different than what he actually says, but certainly it's parenthetical. It stands out from the plot. So either way, we have this wild midrash that is totally a 180 from the pshat, in which Yehuda is his angry, violent self, ready to do again to Egypt what he did to Shechem, who's angry at Yosef, who's lashing out at him for judging them and for accusing them of things that they didn't do. This is not brothers who are saying, uh-oh, this is like punishment for what we did to our brother, right? Which again is in the pshat in last week's Parsha. And Yosef is not an easily forgiving brother. He is super angry still, super hurt. And at every point he says, well, you did that to me. Why should I help you now? You hurt me first. So Nechama Leibowitz is just going to go in a different direction. But from my perspective, this is like the release valve on the pshat conversation. Meaning I can't imagine having that conversation that happens in the pshat. It feels very unrealistic. And I think that this is the thought bubble, right? This is what the brothers are thinking as they say their restrained and polite lines to each other, because you need to have some kind of release valve. You can't just pretend everything is fine when it's not fine, but you also can't destroy all of Egypt and paint the markets red and, stuff boulders in each other's mouths. And so it's almost like speaking to a therapist or taking a walk with a friend and saying like, sometimes I would say, and then I said, well, and I'd say the like sharp thing I meant. And my mother or my father would say, did you really say that? And I was like, no, I didn't say it, but I thought it, right? And so I think that that's like what this midrash is. It's just a way to let out all of that steam, because in real life, it's very hard to be so perfect as to be able to be so restrained and polite and forgiving. So that is my take. Let's go back to Nechama Leibowitz for a second. Right, she asks, what was the reason? Right, this is a fanciful interpretation of Yehuda's moving speech, right? This beautiful speech is a transformation of a skillfully woven emotional appeal and monologue into a bitter, did I spell this word wrong? Denunciation. It did say denunciatory in her book, dialogue. But the fanciful embroidery of our sages is also skillfully built up into a dialogue which moves stage by stage into a climax. There is, however, a difference. Yehuda in the original biblical petition only hints at injustice indirectly. In the Midrash, he beseeches, threatens, and denounces, whilst Yosef aggressively answers him back in a mocking and ironic tone. The rope has followed the bucket. The more Yehuda ranges, the more Yosef angers and wounds him, recalling his treatments of their younger brother in the past. Now, in her mind, right, Yosef, of course, could not have said these words because, it doesn't make sense. He certainly wouldn't have known about Tamar and Yehuda for sure. Who then is the Yosef in the Midrash who plays the role of the accuser? Our sages wish to personify Yehuda's conscience, the inner voice of remorse which plagued him at this turning of the tables. So she is suggesting that this is how Yehuda is working through his guilt at having left Yosef. And I was learning part of this earlier with someone who said to me, well, it makes sense that Yehuda's conscience would be so harsh because we're always harshest on ourselves, right? And, I think her example was like, if you go to the gym and you think that you were really slow or not graceful or not good at whatever you were doing, and then you get off the machine and someone says like, wow, you ran such a fast mile, right? Like our own inner voice is always so much more critical than the outside voices. And so I think in a way this makes a lot of sense, right? Yehuda is worried. He's saying, well, if I say this to Yosef, he's going to bite my head off this way. And if I say it that way, he's going to remind me of this terrible thing I did. And how could I possibly stand in as a surety, right, for Binyamin when I did this terrible thing in Shechem and with Tamar and with Yosef? And it's his own head sort of spiraling and like, how could I be the right person for this job? I brought the footnote. I don't always bring them because it's an interesting story about a midrash about Avraham, right? Where Avraham, so an old man stops Avraham on the way to the Akedah, saying, you know, how could you do this? You waited for the son for so long, right? You'll be denounced as a shedder of blood. And she says that's the struggle that went on in the mind of Avraham, right? There wasn't really an old man who stopped him on the way. The Midrash is imagining what goes on in Abraham's mind. So I think that's an interesting parallel to put here, that these choices that we have to make are very difficult. Right. And she says the more Yehuda denounces the injustice of the region's conduct, the more his conscience reminds him of the injustice that he inflicted. Right. And these are just quotes that she pulls back out from the Midrash. But again, that makes sense that that would sort of be in his head. Well, how could I say that he's judging me unfairly? I judged so unfairly. How could I say, right? It goes on and on. The Midrash contrasts their situation in Egypt, the justice meted out to them, with their conduct towards their brother on the advice of Yehuda in the past. This idea is also expressed in the text itself, and these are the last words, of Judah's speech, where it says, "Va'ata yeshev na avadecha tachat hanar," right? Keep me instead of Binyamin. Hanar eved la'adoni. V'hanar ya'al im achav, and let him go back with his brothers. Once Yehuda, who here represents all of the brothers, had reached the stage of not being able to return to his father without Binyamin, being prepared to give his life for him, the wrong they had all originally perpetrated against their older brother was atoned for, and Yosef could reveal his identity to them. Right, so Nechamas Leibovich sticks very tightly to the sort of more traditional path of Yosef truly being able to forgive his brothers because they showed true teshuvah, and that this inner monologue was needed to get Yehuda from point A to point B. I have a sort of broader read that this is just about letting out our true feelings while still being able to like do the conciliatory thing on the surface. I will say a lot of this reminded me of things we teach our children, or I teach my children. There's a very common phrase these days: you get what you get and you don't get upset. So like if you're at a birthday party and you get the purple balloon instead of the red balloon, the parent says to the child, well, you get what you get and you don't get upset. And I could not tolerate that phrase. I would like whisper to my child, it's okay. It's okay to be upset. Like feel your feelings. You're allowed to be upset, but like we're not swapping. That's what that Abba is saying, right? Not that you can't be upset. Of course you could be upset. You just can't trade, right? And I think on some level, that is what the Midrash is saying, is like, be upset, rage against your brother, have a silly, like, classroom fight, a recess fight over the things that are happening, yell about the things that are unfair. But at the end of the day, there's no swapping. This is what God wanted, and we have to like find a way to make peace with it. But either way, it's a wild midrash. I felt like I had to share it with you guys. I'm going to stop the share so I can see everyone's faces. But I would love to hear what other people think about this midrash or the way the Parsha progresses. It looks like you want to say something, Jerry. Do you have something?
Okay, I think we'll see the pictures. Where? Yours is okay. I'm afraid. But it's funny.
The contrast between the midrash and the actual text is really startling.
Yes.
Yeah. It's like reading the soap opera version of like a genteel conversation.
Yeah.
I certainly like your idea of this representing a dialogue with his own conscience. In fact, I could envision it very closely parallel to Jacob wrestling with the angel, which some call, Esau's guardian angel, the night before. And one could
Mhm.
easily imagine Yehuda ruminating. What do they call it in mental health circles when you just can't let go and you keep going over and
Mhm.
over and over and arguing in your
perseverating.
Perseverating, that's a good one. Yeah.
so this is what's going on inside while he's crafting or even extemporizing this wonderful speech. He can hear the retorts that
Mm.
are not being made, which probably Joseph is thinking.
I think so, right?
I think, I truly believe that all of us are capable of intuiting or, extrasensory perception much more than we think we can because we're trained out of thinking that way. But
Mm.
little children can pick up feelings of grown-ups around them even before they become articulate enough to talk about what's going on.
Well, when we read that Yosef cannot control his tears, he goes into the other room and weeps. I can't accept even in any way what the Midrash does. I can't, because if Yosef's feelings are this way and are his unconscious feelings or his under the surface feelings, that doesn't go with being overcome with emotion and the tears flowing. It just doesn't go together.
I don't know. I would argue that it's being torn in both directions. On the one hand, he wants so much to, repair that bond, or, he wants so much to be part of the family, which he never could be because they were always rejecting him.
I like
Um,
the way you said that it tears both ways. I also think the tears, at least again on the pshat level, are about Binyamin at first, right? He cries on Binyamin's neck. I think like there is a little bit of a divide between, right? Yosef cries for Binyamin and he cries for Yaakov at their reunions. Um, Less so about the brothers, right? He's less overcome when the 10 brothers show up at the beginning. The first time where he accuses them of being spies. And so I sort of wonder if the like true emotion that's displayed is more for like the family that treated him well, and the anger that the Midrash is assigning him is for the other brothers. I think that's possible. Or I think that it, as Judith said, like I wonder how much it's both, right? Like it must have been such an emotionally confusing time. Presumably, he'd been waiting 20 years for this moment. And he must have thought that he would like it. Or maybe he thought that he would tell his brothers what he thought. And then at the moment, he was actually just overcome with joy, right? He was probably lonely in Egypt. Like, I could imagine a lot of competing feelings.
He does hear real remorse
Hmm.
in the speech of his brothers to one another when they don't know that he's listening or that he understands them, for that matter. Doesn't that bring the tears as well when he hears that true remorse? And
Yeah. Yeah. I mean that right that's like the traditional read is like showing full teshuva moved Yosef both to tears and to a complete forgiveness. Which is beautiful. Like I think that's lovely, but for me I feel like I don't think I could do that, right? Nothing nearly as bad as what happened to Yosef has ever happened to me. And yet I can't imagine being quite so gracious in such a situation.
I think he
Um,
was cautious. I think Joseph,
hmm.
was very cautious every step of the way when he realized they were his brothers from the first visit.
Mhm. Right. If he truly was overcome with joy at seeing them, he might have cut the whole testing period short. I think that's a good point, right? But there is a cautiousness. And honestly, who could blame him, right? Even if this conversation with Yehuda about like burning Egypt to the ground didn't take place, certainly they don't have a good track record with Yosef, you know. Even if they didn't intend to sell him, they intended to throw him in the pit, right? They didn't like him. Yeah, I mean, I think your question, Tamar, is very fair. This is a wild midrash. Like, why did the rabbis who wrote Tanchuma think that they could write such a thing? That was my question when I read it the first time. Like, usually the midrash hangs itself onto something in the pasuk or the psukim, and this is like an almost totally opposite read of the psukim. I wish that I could go back and like ask them what motivated them, right? How did they
Yes, that would be wonderful.
right? Why was this the direction that you went in? And I do think that like our own self-conscious, our own subconscious is our harshest critic is a very true sentiment. And that maybe that's part of what they're just trying to say, right? Yehuda was worried because he knew that he had done the wrong thing in life. And so he had so much more to overcome to do his full teshuvah. Or maybe Yosef was worried that even if the brothers passed all the tests and it seemed like they did full teshuvah, like how could he really trust that, right? How could he stop being cautious, right? Even if it's not read with quite as much mocking and derision, right, as the Chamalivovich says, that it just shows how anxious he is about moving forward with the brothers.
He's anxious about moving forward with the brothers, and he also is cautious about how they treat Benjamin. He doesn't know. He's been away for 20 years, and he knows that Benjamin and himself were the sons of Becca,
Right, the favored wife. Yeah.
the favored wife. So
Although I
he
have to say, yeah, go ahead.
so I think he tested by saying that that Benjamin stole something and put the brothers in a position of trying to handle the whole situation to see how they would behave toward Benjamin.
Right. Yes. And again, like Sherry, you just beautifully described the like sort of classic approach to that piece. I have to say another thing that I has always rubbed me the wrong way about that is like Yosef takes no personal responsibility for being an unfavored brother. He assumes it's only because he is the son of Rachel that the brothers hate him. But that's not actually true, right? It's the way that he talks about his dreams that rub the brothers the wrong way. It's the fact that he brings back bad reports about his brothers to his father. And so to worry that Benjamin would be treated the same way, I think shows that he misses his role in the brotherly conflict. Right? Like that always annoyed me about Yosef. Yeah, like I have to admit, I should have turned off the recording. Too late now. I have to admit, this is not my favorite parsha. Neither is Miketz or Vayichi. Like to me, it's a sad ending of a story that is like almost past saving. And I think that's a little bit of what we see next week in Vayichi is like even Yaakov's deathbed, story is filled with tension and recriminations and it doesn't feel like the resolution I would have hoped for at the end of the Sefer, maybe is how I would say it. And I think all the brothers have like sort of confusing problems to them, right? Yosef doesn't own his role. The brothers don't own theirs. They sort of just patch it all up and say, I'm sorry, okay, no problem, don't worry about it. But then we see it sort of come back over and over throughout Tanakh, right? Like with Pinchas, right? Pinchas and Zimri and Kasbi, when Pinchas spears those two people, right? They're I can't remember who it is that says, but that they're from two different tribes, and this is sort of like an echoing of a fight that has been going on for generations, right? Like, what if instead of just being in the Midrash Tanchuma in their subconscious, what if they had just actually aired their issues and worked through them, right? This is such a modern lens that I'm offering, right? But like the problems festered, and as they fester, they grow into like a decades and generations long issue, right? And so like every year I want to say like stop, just take a minute, figure it out. don't let Yaakov die with such like frustration in his heart, and don't don't enter into this period of slavery with so many tensions. Like you're the only brothers you have, right? I say that to my kids all the time. um
It's interesting that both the brothers and Yosef undergo a kind of a reversal. Yosef starts out as the spoiled and insensitive and self-absorbed younger brother.
mhm.
And the brothers at that point are hateful and angry and unforgiving. And by the end of the story, Yosef has become sensitive and forgiving. And he tries to ease their pain by telling God wanted it to be this way. God has created this situation. While the brothers, from their formerly hateful, angry selves, have been transformed into conscience-stricken individuals. So they've each undergone a kind of a reversal.
Yeah. Which, like, look, I would like to believe that happens, right? They grew up, they matured, they suffered hard times that hopefully that weathered them. They came out stronger for it, right? But it's also a little hard, it feels to me like at the end of those Hallmark movies where like they've run out of money to finish the story, so like everyone makes up and goes home. And they all lived happily ever after.
I don't
Yeah.
know. Everyone in this story is responsible for all of this
Ah,
confusion, not least of all Yaakov,
yeah,
who
totally.
in several instances is angry at what one or another of the sons do, but he may or may not express that in some way, but then it says, he took note, he thought about it. He didn't go into a long discussion and critique of their behavior till later. It all comes out on his deathbed when he's making the blessings. But when Joseph reveals his dreams that make the brothers so angry, remember that Yaakov also takes offense. You mean you're expecting your mother and father to bow down to you? But then it says, yes, but he took note, he kept it in mind. All right, that's understandable. But it doesn't sound as if he gave a lecture on arrogance to Joseph or tried to help the young
Yeah.
man explain how some of the connection that the two of them had might be taken amiss by the brothers and so on.
Yeah. I read this beautiful idea that the problem of Breshit, of like the whole Sefer, is about a misunderstanding of what it means to be chosen, right? That at each generation, there's a choosing that maybe feels unnecessary. And no, none of the chosen children ever think, oh, maybe I shouldn't create another generation of chosenness, right? Yaakov sees the like immense damage that his chosenness has done, and he continues to create a chosen one and not chosen ones. And that then even when Yosef brings Menashe and Ephraim in next week's Parsha, right, to Yaakov, and he switches right, Yaakov switches the hands, right? He refuses to stop choosing. Um, my friend and colleague Rabbi Tali Adler said that when we give brachot to our own children on Friday night, we don't say just Ephraim or just Menashe, but we say Ephraim v'Menashe as like a way of sort of saying like we've learned. Maybe they didn't learn it in Breshit, but we've learned like chosenness can be harmful and create a lack of unity, and what we need is unity, right? We need there to stop being so much chosenness. I thought that was a beautiful thought. But I think what you're saying reminded me of it, right? That like no one seems to learn from the past mistakes. They keep right on plowing through them over and over.
Well,
And
it's the beginning of civilization, so there's not that many people to learn from behind them.
that's true. That's true. Right. But you would think that Yaakov might have been more careful in choosing a child. Right now, granted, he doesn't send the others into the, the desert to die like Abraham did for Yishmael, and he doesn't, they don't try to kill each other in quite such a vicious way as Esav and Yaakov maybe did. But yeah, I like what you said, Judith, about the battle that Yaakov has before he meets up with Esav, right? Because some people say it's not really the angel of Esav, but it's his own self that Yaakov had to, right, do really have that inner dialogue, the subconscious critique of himself, which we're not privy to. Wouldn't that be cool if Tanchuma had written his inner dialogue up too, right?
Just the notion that he had transgressed by not only taking the blessing, but lying to get it.
Yeah.
And one can see, as Rabbi Sachs does, that all of that performance of sending the portions of the family and the huge gifts of cattle and whatnot is a way of expressing that he's giving the blessing back to Esau. The blessing was of material wealth and power. And so he's demonstrating that, yes, he has acquired this, but he doesn't need to keep it, and he's sharing it with Esau.
Yeah.
And Esau kind of scratches his head. You get the picture. He's a little puzzled by all this, but okay, I'll take it as a gesture and
Yeah.
move on. I also, another story resonates with me, and I mentioned this before, that my husband came up with this interpretation that Joseph doesn't really know who was behind that plot to put him in the pit and so on. He, as far as Joseph knows, he could have sensed that his father was upset by his I don't want to say arrogance all the time, but he's big ideas. And
Mm-hmm.
for all he knows, his father could have put the brothers up to this, or at least not inhibited their negative thoughts about Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Ted puts this forth as a potential psychological reason why he was afraid to get in touch with people back home. And when the brothers eventually, when he reveals himself, makes it clear, um, especially in Yehuda's speech, that their father was incredibly upset by the loss of Joseph and were misinformed or misled. He
Mm-hmm.
was misled. That evokes Joseph's tears. And one could read that story as Joseph really responding to the notion that his little family, his father and his younger brother, is still the back home that he's buried in his mind. He's tried to forget his past
Mm-hmm.
life and confirms that in the way
Maybe is
he
what brings up
names
the
his
tears.
children. Mhm.
Yeah.
So when he finds out, no, he made that up, they're mourning for him deeply, and
Mm-hmm.
they miss him too. That's when
Yeah.
tears spring.
Yeah. I think that is a very beautiful interpretation. And I think, look, the Midrash actually goes like a little wild in this week's Parsha. And I think that partially that is because there is so much left unsaid, right? The surface is shown. It's like we can see sort of like the set, right? From the front, from the audience side. But to make it work, there had to be so much work being done behind the scenes. And the Midrash wants to help us sort of understand, like, how could this thing have happened? Well, it must have been that there was this story and this story, right? There's the beautiful Midrash bat Serach bat Asher, who breaks the news of Yosef being alive to Yaakov with her heart playing, right? And I think like that too, right? Like, how do you possibly tell an old man that you actually didn't kill his son, or sorry, that you didn't leave his son for dead, right? But you sold him and now he's reappeared in Egypt, right? Like, it's just, there's so many places where I imagine the rabbis were like, well, how did that really happen? How did that go down, right? How could that have gotten us to the next step? How could you possibly have forgiven so quickly? Well, there must have been like this much more difficult conversation that preceded the forgiveness, right? And so I think I appreciate that the Midrash is like being real, right? This is real people have real emotions, but at the end of the day, like Yosef, we can have some ability to forgive as well. Because, right, I think many people, Rabbi Sachs included, have said so beautifully that forgiveness is like the gift Yosef gives us. It's the first time anyone forgives in the Torah. And so we can have the real emotions, we can feel angry, we can feel forgotten, and we can still find forgiveness at the end. Like it actually makes it even greater, not less than.
There is a kind of parallel between Esav's forgiveness of his brother and Yosef's. In each case, the sinned against is capable of forgiving the grave sin that was perpetrated. And I guess in a way it's a lesson to the rest of, if they could forgive, then maybe I should be able to forgive the far less severe sin that I have suffered, you know.
Yes, that's a good question about Esau, right? I think he just doesn't use that explicit word of forgiveness in the same way. But yes, it's true. Esau does in some way forgive. I agree. But meaning, the examples are like when Abraham prayed for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, he didn't say, God, forgive them. He said, God, there's an injustice, right? God doesn't forgive us after the flood, but he promises a better future, right? And so like this sort of explicit language of like, I forgive you for the thing you did, right? Which is not the part we looked at that comes after that, right? When Yosef says, when the brothers are like a little bit nervous and he says, no, it's okay, right? Hold on. Where's the actual language here? Right, he embraces Binyamin. Hold on, I have to find it. Oops, let's see. It's much later. It's in next week's Parsha, the explicit forgiveness, I guess. It's in chapter Perek Nun, I think.
You know, tampering.
18. Hold on one second. I'm almost there. Oh, here it is. Sa na pesha achacha. I forgive, I urge you the offense and guilt of your brothers. And Joseph says, again, it's no problem. He is kind, right? He forgives them. And so that language of sana, right, which is like the salachna of the Torah, is the language that is new in some level. So, but yes, I think Asaph does it does seem he forgives. That's an interesting thing to look up. I'll have to look at that next time.
I think
Okay. Yeah, sorry. I'll give you the last part.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
No, please.
I was going to say, I was just thinking of an instance where the Navi quotes God as expressing forgiveness, where he says, "L'rega katan azavtich, ketzav histarti panai mimech." So there's a strong current of forgiveness there.
Yeah. Yes, isn't that
I don't remember which Navi or where that comes up.
actually I think it might be in our Haftorah. Hold on. I'd have to find it. I read so many things in my panic about what Dresha to give this week, but I do think that's connected to this week's Parsha. I'd have to see what the Haftarah is this week. From Yechezkel. Maybe it's not this one. But yes, I think it's a good point that actually God, right, is a teacher of how we should apologize, but the first example, like of a human forgiveness, is Yosef. We'll have to find.
I'll just
Wow,
throw a little wrinkle in there that Aviva Zornberg sees this ending as a little darker. She points out that none of them outright apologize to one another, and that Yosef, for all of his attempt to be accommodating and forgiving, is still kind of lording it over them. But, he says, it's okay. I have a hotline to God that you folks don't.
Yeah, certainly you could read it that way. I think that's fair, right? The pshat is not quite as clear as we made it out to be. It could be read in a slightly different tone than it had been. And because, right, why are the brothers so nervous if Yosef had truly forgiven them? Right? Maybe his tone showed that perhaps he had not in quite such a strong way.
Also, he had attained in life a position where, I mean, Joseph, where he was able to lord over the doling out of supplies so they don't starve to death.
Right.
So they were afraid on many levels.
Yes. Yes, look, I think it takes a long time, right? I think time is sometimes what we need. And it takes a lot longer than 3 or 4 meetings to really show each other how we feel about that, about something. For sure. It's very complicated. And I think the Midrash brings up a lot of good questions, helps us think about it again, right? Not just to gloss over it and keep going. And I love to see the rabbinic imagination at work, right? Such a strong imagination. Well, I wish
Thank you.
everyone a final night or two, depending. I assume most people have lit their candles already, but a happy Hanukkah, and that everyone should stay warm this Shabbos. If you are willing to brave the cold, I will be at shul. I would love to see you. There'll also be women's learning at 3 p.m. in the rabbinic suite for Rosh Chodesh, and a Malava Malka at 6 after Shabbat is over. Jam packing all of my teaching and programming into one Shabbat. And I hope everyone is well, and I'll see you soon. An early Shabbat Shalom and happy Hanukkah.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom and
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat
And Happy
Shalom.
New Year. Shabbat Shalom.
Right, that's right.
That too.